This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is committed to keeping you ever current on topics that matter to you, like artificial intelligence. Learn more at pli.edu/AIPod.
Welcome to AI and Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. I'm William Tanenbaum, host of the podcast and head of AI and data practice at Moses & Singer in New York. In this series, we bring you the latest perspectives on AI and data through timely talks with thought leaders working at the intersection of AI, data, and the law. In this episode, my guest is Jon Lightman, the lead of the Americas Banking and Financial Service of advisory firm ISG. Our topic is Generative AI, Business Transformation, and Outsourcing. So, Jon, it's kind of interesting to be in the same office, even though we're not in the same office, because I'm in my office, my beautiful office, and you're in our beautiful conference room.
I think if you stamp on the floor, you can probably, I'll probably be able to hear you, depending on how good the soundproofing is in your office.
Behind me, you see a very nice picture. That is actually a photograph of Lake Placid in the Adirondacks. Very pleased to say I took that, and the AI in my camera made it look good.
Excellent. We all need AI to make us look good, right?
All right. Well, this is great. And Jon, you've had a great career, and I'm going to ask that you kind of walk us through your career arc, starting at, whatever foreign country you started in and up to your current leadership position in ISG. And when you get there, tell us about ISG as well.
Certainly, I can do that. Thank you so much, Bill. So yes, I actually did start my career as an attorney or solicitor, as we say in the United Kingdom, at a firm that at the time was is now called Mayer Brown and was called Rowan Moore when I joined, but was merged back in, I think, 2001 timeframe. And I started my career actually as an intellectual property lawyer. And of course, as you know, in the 90s, the technology law was starting to become a real thing. And I got kind of pulled into some of the early days of the technology outsourcing, and also, the dot-com bubble that burst in the 90s, all the year 2000 stuff. So I sort of, over time, got a little bit pulled into technology law. And then in the early 2000s, I was doing a number of deals as a lawyer, and I recognized that perhaps some of the deals themselves were not as well constructed or well thought through, or, the commercial aspect of them were in some cases flawed. And as a lawyer, you're very much at the end of the process. You're perfecting, you're papering, these things. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be more fun to be involved at the outset and be a consultant and help clients and organizations to actually develop the right kind of deals and then go forth and actually, So I did that. Foolish. I was young at the time, youngish, and I joined a company called TPI that was the founder of the sourcing advisory marketplace, I guess, back in the late 80s, based out of Houston. And that company was acquired about 15 or 16 years ago by ISG, which is the firm that I currently work for. So that actually means that I've been 20 years in December with the same organization.
Well, I'm pleased to say you don't look like you've been any place for 20 years, but
Thank you. That's very kind. Again, that's probably the AI filter that is. So I've had a number of roles within the organization for the first 10 years or so. I did mostly delivery, where I was working with clients on solving their specific problems, all, traditional ITO, business process outsourcing, financial services outsourcing, many different challenges, a lot of work around M&A and divestiture and all that good stuff. And the last couple of roles that I've had within ISG, I won't drain it, but for about 7 years, I ran our life science practice, our industry vertical. I'm now based in New York, I should have said, moved over in 2009. And then I helped to build out our market-facing teams, which we call our markets, conveniently. And just as of about a month or so ago, I took on a leadership role for our Americas BFS practice lead. So back to an industry-focused role, but a slightly different industry than one that I was supporting previously. So a lot of years in broadly the outsourcing and transformation world, and happy to share some of my hopefully insightful thoughts with you today.
Well, as a base for that, I know your role's expanded, so tell us a little bit more about, your scope and remit.
Certainly. So, I think in common with most organizations, we recognize that verticalization is very important. And that what works for banks and financial services institutions is not necessarily the same kind of thing. They're all on different trajectories. They're all at different points in the cycle. They're all affected differently by technology and by macroeconomic and global factors. And as we see a drive towards platformization and all of these areas, it's very critical that we are able to meet our clients where they are and understand their unique, challenges and perspectives. So, BFSI is one of those areas that was an early adopter of large transformation initiatives, be they outsourcing, be they technology, and in common with, other industries, they've seen, waves of, I guess, being ahead of the curve, being at the forefront of the curve, and somewhere perhaps they lag a little bit behind. Again, regulated industries, so there's certain things that are more challenging to do in BFS than in others. So my current role is really to kind of deploy what ISG has to offer across those clients. And I haven't really said what ISG has to offer yet.
Dude, come ahead, because we've had the pleasure of working together. And I think people should know a little bit, how it's transferred from outsourcing to the current AI environment.
Absolutely. And I see the firm of ISG, we're an independent advisory firm. We're about 1,400 people globally, NASDAQ listed. And our remit, broadly, we call ourselves a technology research and advisory firm, but really our remit is to help large companies, large enterprises through managing, transformation and adoption of technology at scale. Everything is technology, right? These days. So, dial back 10, 15 years and, HR might have been people with filing cabinets, et cetera. But now, it's Workday. So ultimately, everything comes down to how do you effectively implement technology in your organization and how do you make it available to your people and to your customers and to your partners. And so really our organization looks at driving those kind of transformations. How do you do it effectively? How do you do it cost effectively? What are the business cases and how do you ensure success? And tactically, some of our work would be around, how do you do a large-scale outsourcing transformation? Some of it might be how do you build a global capability center or captive, as we used to call it. Some of it may be around how do you optimize some of the, the mess in your technology or back office organization through, simplification or vendor consolidation, all those kind of things. But also, where should you be investing your dollars? Where are you going to get a strong ROI on your investment in improvement or in deployment of new technologies? And so AI obviously plays into all of those, both in terms of it is going to be a lever in terms of driving down cost and taking human effort out of certain systems, and outsourcing is going to be one of the early adopters of those models, and we can talk more, I guess, about some of the risks.
Yeah, I'd like to get into that because I think, a lot of outsourcing is business transformation. And now you have all this AI, which is, you've got the machine learning on the one side, and now you've got content generation through generative AI. So I think it'd be really interesting to talk about the outsourcing spin on this as opposed to internal enterprise adoption.
Certainly. Look, I think that there's a phrase about what's old is new again, and there's certainly, and what's new is old, or something along those lines. I'm sure someone can fact check me, but I think the thing about AI is there are some elements of it that I think are exactly the same as previous waves of transformation, and some that are very different.
So let's do both of those.
So I guess the first category is what's the same. So if you think about outsourcing, each wave of outsourcing has tried to leverage a different way to essentially do the same thing better and cheaper and faster. And so the very first wave of outsourcing might have simply been around consolidation and saying, well, if I'm an IBM back in the 80s and 90s, I can do this at scale. So I have economies of scale. Why do you need to have this expertise? It's outsource. It's not your core competency. And then came along labor arbitrage, which said, well, actually, we can do some of these tasks for cheaper. And then you had, degrees of automation around robotic process automation that say, why do you even need people at all? So I think AI will continue in that vein of saying, how do we take the human effort out of certain systems? And I think in that sense, it's going to be very analogous to some of those prior waves. And what I mean by that is, I think they were probably oversold at the beginning. They weren't as mature as the salespeople in those organizations said, but they were used as a marketing tool. So the offshore vendors at the time back in the 90s were saying, well, look, we can have software developers for a third of the cost of having someone sitting in New York. But the reality was that the business case didn't just automatically unlock itself. People had to build whole new governance structures to be able to hand off work to different teams in different time zones. And I'm not sure that there was ever really an equivalence of, person here sitting right next to the business, one-to-one. I think they kind of faked it till they maked it. If there's a past of that phrase. But eventually, over time, they got it right. And I think there'll be a similar kind of maturation where big service providers will come along and say, we are deploying AI and we'll save you 20, 30, 40%. And I think some of that will be real and some of that will be marketing feel. But it is a journey that they're going to be on, and they'll sign 5-year deals. And in order to make their business cases, they'll have to actually make that work. So I think that's one element where, that it is kind of the same as we've seen before. It's just an acceleration of that. How do we reduce price, increase efficiency, increase quality, and so that's in the former category.
So it sounds to me like it's falling into the continuum of kind of replacing and augmenting what humans do.
So that's where it's the same. I think where it's very different is, we talk about Gen AI and we talk about AI. There's another area where I think it is kind of analogous. Sorry, I know you asked me the second question. I'm returning to the first one. But if you think about data and analytics has been promising insights and actionable insights for a long time. Before we kind of overlaid AI on it. And I think there are elements of, predictive maintenance and how do you, both in technology and in, manufacturing and other areas, how do you say, well, this part is going to fail, so let's swap it out now. How do I predict what you're going to, have a problem with and provide you with training in advance? I think AI and Gen AI will accelerate that and perhaps realize some of the benefits of that. I think where it's different is that it is going to be, generating new ideas, new content, but it's also going to be delving into areas where I think there's going to be some unintended or unforeseen consequences. And so it needs to be tempered a little bit with the boring stuff that everyone wants to talk about AI, but nobody wants to talk about governance. And governance, unfortunately, is the way that we make sure that all of these new ideas are adopted in a way that is secure and protected within the organization. So, when I talk about, new areas, we were talking about how do we have predictive maintenance and somebody's calling up a contact center and I can solve their problem in advance so they don't even need to call the contact center. But now you're going to have issues where someone's going to call a contact center and the AI is going to say, well, actually, probably you want to, tell the agent you want to upsell, a financial service product to Jon Lightman because he our algorithm says that he probably wants to buy a mortgage right now. And that's going to be a revenue generator for that organization. Now, imagine that I'm a service provider and I trained my AI algorithm on your organization. The basic premise of outsourcing has been, if we're better at doing all this back office stuff, we're leaner, everyone benefits. So if I learn from company A, take some of those learnings to company B, deploy them, also learn from company B. It's a virtuous circle where everyone benefits and it's not really giving anyone a competitive advantage. But what if I train my AI bot on company A and deploy it at company B, and company B sells a lot more of its stuff than company A did, either because of certain factors within, they were a bit more behind the curve, or because I took all the time to train, retrain, course correct and all that. So I think there are going to be questions about whether outsourcing in some of these areas has moved. And it always, if you think about digital transformation, it's always, started to bleed into middle and front office where actually some of this technology can be revenue generating. Some of these insights can drive, incremental, benefits for these customers. So I think in that area, there's going to be some very clear, who owns the data that trains the AI, or how do I monetize my data? Now, there are probably some some analogies for that as well. I mean, we're a ICS benchmarking firm. We get our data from company A and company B and company C, and we anonymize it and we throw it all in a bucket and we say, what's the right price for a laptop? So there are models for how do you share value from data, but I think AI will kind of bring some of those to the fore.
I think that, the question of everybody benefits. So if you're a customer, your position may be, I want to keep this, I'm giving you all kinds of company advantages, and I don't want you to make them part of your service offering so that my competitors get it. So that's kind of a standard outsourcing concern. And there's some kind of standard practices that have evolved from that. So how do we deal with the question that when we're applying a vendor's AA model to a customer's data set, you're not sure what learnings are being learned, and you're not sure what's being shared. So I know you're at the forefront of this stuff. So I don't want an answer. I want you to kind of say what the thinking is on both sides.
I think it's back to my point about governance. Like when you're presented with a set of known unknowns, you can kind of map them. You can create use cases. You can model them out. That's to some extent what any contract does. It says, well, if this happens, then this happens. If there's a force majeure event, then this. What we're dealing with some of this is the unknown unknowns, and in those situations, trying to legislate for them in advance is a fool's errand. And I think what you need to do is you need to set up the processes that some guardrails that say, why are we doing this? Who's trying to get value for what? How do we ascribe the risks associated? Who's taking the risks? Who's going to reap the benefits? And back to your point about let's just do it within the four walls of the company. Well, software development started like that, and then everyone ended up with their own bespoke version of stuff that did all the same stuff. Sorry, I shouldn't overuse the word stuff, but you know what I'm saying.
Sure.
Then people said, well, actually, what we want off-the-shelf stuff. We want commercial off-the-shelf because everyone's getting the benefit of the developments. You're paying in, but who's influencing the roadmap of the development of those products? Well, the answer is the people who spend the most money with it. So I think AI will be one where it won't be a case of, well, we have $1 million to invest in this product. Let's do it in the features and functionalities that Jon wants, because he's the biggest buyer of this software. It will be, we don't know where the benefits are going to come. So when they come, will it be that they'll actually have to be a revenue sharing, where if you're the service provider and you might be working on a contingency basis or a risk reward or some kind of gain share model, where I, as customer A, actually get some of the revenue that you generate with customer B. I mean, those models are they're not attractive to the service providers, but at least it incentivizes me to share if I know I'm going to participate in some of the benefit that's been generated. But that now starts to really, even audit rights. I remember, sorry to get all legal about it, but I am a former lawyer. We used to have these arguments about most favored customer clauses. Well, how do you enforce them without understanding what you service provider are doing for your other customers, which is confidential? So I can't audit those kinds of things. And I think that we're going to get into those issues around ecosystems where vendors are, supporting multiple enterprises. It's in the enterprise's advantage that they are spreading this knowledge around and developing use cases and developing and training their AI models using all the data that's available to them. But how do you then share out some of those benefits? I think that's where we're going to get to is, negotiating these outsourcing contracts is going to have a very clear link into governance that says, here's some guardrails. If we give you a lot of data that ends up being tremendously valuable to you, we probably want to cut of that.
So let's just take a step back and dive down into what governance is. That's the first question. And then since I work with you a lot, I know what you're going to say, but I want you to say it anyhow. And then my question is going to be, how should the governance model change? Who should be on the governance committee or the steering committee when AI, I think the cool in the sense of interesting is, you're going to develop AI, or IP, and I know we've talked because you're an IP lawyer, as am I. So we're going to develop this IP is going to be developed. We don't know what it is, and therefore it is a known unknown. But at the end of the day, someone's got to own it and someone's got to have license rights to it. But before we get to what changes, let's just talk about basically what the role of governance is and why you need to have it.
And not to go back on the point you just made, but I mean, the reality is that right now there is no IP protection for material that's created by AI, because copyright and all these things, they are works which need to be created by a human. So I think that will get resolved, but we are it's worth acknowledging that we're in a weird period where the law has not caught up with technology, and probably the same as, I know we've talked about this and there have been conferences about it, early days of photography, there was no copyright for photographs because they were not created by a person. Then they said, well, actually there's a photographer who's framing and lighting and all these things. And so then it was considered to be a work. So I think we'll get there. But just getting back to governance. So, historically governance is really just setting up the structures that you need and the information flows you need to make good decisions based on a set of kind of overarching or governing principles. So in outsourcing, it's been done the same way for decades, which is really a series of different forums or fora, whatever the plural is. It's a long time since I studied Latin, but you're setting up a number of different, forums where people are going to talk about issues, talk about opportunities, talk about challenges, and decide how we're going to go forward. A simple example might be a contract says, Bill, you're providing me with reports, and I want you to provide them to me periodically. And then we get into the deal, and I say I want them daily, and you say, well, when I said periodically, what I really meant was monthly. And then we sit down and we talk about it. It's an interpretation of the contract, and we agree that actually it's probably daily is probably not reasonable, and maybe weekly is okay. And then we document that, we enshrine it in some kind of a library. And then if we ever have that discussion again, here it is. It's searchable. It's in my it's in my governance library. So it's really just hygiene around how do we manage a large relationship where there's many different moving parts.
And my view on this is it's somewhat dynamic. So in the beginning, when you're doing the pilot phase, then you're doing the rollout, then you kind of stabilize it. Some of the issues go away and some of the new issues come up, right? So then outsourcing starts to focus on different things because the old problems are not problems and the new problems were either anticipated so you can plan for them, or it's just kind of an organic growth, especially with accelerating technology. So I know you have a lot of experience in that. So is outsourcing staged in that way?
So I think so there's a number of different factors coming in right now, and AI is just one of them. But I think the most important thing is that we when outsourcing was first developed, the kind of the panacea was that you would get to some kind of a steady state. And actually, it was a reaction against the kind of, hero culture in a lot of enterprises where people rolled up their sleeves and stuff got done, but there was no standardization. So the idea is, here's a Sev1 incident, so we need to resolve it within a certain period of time. Back in, the example we used to give in the 90s was, if the CEO's VCR on their yacht went down, that was the most important thing for the IT team to go deal with, because they were going to get fired if he couldn't record, an episode of Dallas. Meanwhile, the data center might be burning, but you got to do what God tells you to do. So, outsourcing was kind of a reaction to that and saying, well, look, let's pre-agree what's important, what's not. Let's try and get to this kind of fabled steady state. Now, of course, what's happened with the adoption of different business models, agility, AI, and others is we're actually in a period of what I would call kind of continuous transformation. And so this whole idea of baking in a steady state with service levels, actually the pendulum needs to swing the other way. We need, what I've been calling service levers, which is the ability to drive the service provider through governance and through prioritization to say, well, actually this week, what's more important is that we get this project over the line. And maybe we can relax some of keep the lights on stuff because we need to reprioritize. So I think governance actually becomes, as you said, you used the D word, much more dynamic. But you need much smarter people. And I'm not besmirching vendor management people, but a lot of times vendor management has been seen as a process flow and we got an invoice, we've got to validate it. That needs to go to so-and-so to figure out we consumed this amount of stuff. It's been very turn the handle. We need to use technology to free people up to actually make the business decisions and be closer to the business. We also, I think, need to have governance across multiple vendors. So governance was always seen as, well, I'm leveraging, service provider A, and my governance model with them is we have these forums and we have these, and maybe in the old days you would have operating level agreements or OLAs where there was some boundary between that provider and some other providers that would be legislated for or managed through governance. But now we're seeing these ecosystems of different vendors that play important roles, and they all need to work together. And if you're going to use levers, if you're going to push one, you might need to pull another. So the whole thing needs to work as one edifice. And again, I don't think we've solved for this, but I've been thinking a lot more about kind of ecosystem governance, and that that really allows you to solve for complicated problems based on principles at a high level. And then it's almost sort of inverting the pyramid where you're starting with the difficult discussion and then waterfalling it down, rather than the old idea, which was that governance starts with the little problems, gets resolved at the lowest level, and only gets escalated if it's important enough for the important people to talk about.
So I hear you saying two things. I hear you saying that the composition, the people with different skills has to change on governance. And I also hear you saying that, in a multi-provider environment, let's pick up on the ecosystem thing, because it's not like you're sending it to an IT company in India that can take advantage of compute and take advantage of lower salaries and take advantage of equally skilled people. Now we've got, you're going to have different kinds of AI providers, different kinds of models. A company might be experimenting to see which one really works, because that's probably the best way. Since you don't know what it's doing, why don't you compare it to something else? At least you have a baseline. So am I right? I mean, is governance evolving for this multi-provider environment?
I think that it certainly should. I'm not sure that it has.
Okay.
I think it's an underinvested area, and I think there's another structural challenge in my book. And again, not sure who's going to be watching or listening to this, so I need to be careful what I say. But I think that we've created these very calcitrated edifices within organizations of vendor management and procurement that have built up over time to do a certain thing. And one of those is to drive process standardization. And one of the things that we're going to need to do here is say, okay, all very well, it's good to have process standardization when you're paying an invoice, but process standardization when you're deciding the value that your provider can bring you today versus tomorrow, some of that's going to have to go out the window. So I think one of the biggest impediments is actually going to be, ironically, the way that organizations are structured today. We are going to, there's the old phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But, I think the answer is break it. I think a lot of the challenges are not the models don't exist, but it's like the QWERTY keyboard. There are lots of better ways of entering data, but we're so, we're so embedded with this QWERTY keyboard that we continue to use it because everyone knows it, everyone's been trained on it. I think it might be time right now to kind of break it down and rebuild it from the ground up and say, what are we actually trying to achieve here? How do we get different vendors to play nice in an ecosystem, and recognize that ultimately, if the client is happy and the client's business is supported, then all the vendors in that ecosystem there should be some upside for them. It's not an us and them, it's a we. Now, that might be a little bit of a, I'll get my guitar out and start, playing campfire songs. But the reality is that the traditional mode of outsourcing has not been wildly successful. It certainly moved things forward in fits and starts, but it certainly hasn't been successful in deploying innovation. And as you were saying, innovation often happens in small proof of concept. And then you need to bring in a partner that can scale that and make it enterprise grade. And that's where most organizations historically have failed.
Can you have non-enterprise grade AI?
Look, you can have point solution AI, but that makes governance even more important, because if you're deploying AI in little parts of your organization, you need to have guiding principles and have a way that it's managed, make sure that you're within security, protocols, and that it adheres to all of your all of your regulatory compliance. I mean, I'll give you a silly little example that I was reading about, which was, where the unknown piece of it, which is, I'm a retailer and I deploy AI just to look at, markdowns in my store. Should I be marking that sweater down by 10%, 20%, 30%. What's going to shift my inventory? That's been done very manually, apparently, by store managers, kind of just knowing their market. But what if I deploy an AI to look at what's the optimal markdown? Well, what if the store next door to you also deploys AI to look at their markdown, and the two AI engines start to talk to one another? Now you're in collusion and price fixing territory. You're subject to, you didn't even know that your AI was talking to their AI and causing you, potential, legal regulatory concerns. So I think stuff like that will start to come out of the woodwork. And I think when it's not deployed at enterprise grade, there's actually more risk that some of those things, because when it's deployed at a small scale, you don't put the kind of, you don't go through the kind of, security checks and architecture checks and et cetera, et cetera.
So you mentioned that ISG does some benchmarking. I want to twist that a little bit. When we're talking about point of use, which are the first ones and which are the valuable ones?
So I do think that a lot of the use cases that we're seeing now are sort of an amplification of what was already being talked about in data and analytics, which was this idea of being able to predict failure and adapt for it or solve it before the problem actually happens. It's a little bit Minority Report territory, but if you can say that I'm rolling out, I'm deploying a new screen that my clients are going to see, or my customers are going to see, and things have changed around. Let's just put a little thing that says, things have changed, and here's we've been doing that for a long time. Here's what's changed, and you're going to see. But I think that AI will amplify, those areas of, can we make investments up front to reduce. I also think that there are, great AI use cases of looking at customers and being more individual and thinking about their individual financial needs and what products do they need, what should I sell to them. I already talked earlier in the discussion about the upsell opportunities at the contact center. Contact center was seen as kind of a cost historically, but actually where you make contact with your customers is a key point of differentiation now. And they now, I think contact centers will be some of the value drivers. That's one of the, when people don't go into a branch of a retail bank anymore, where are they actually touching your organization? They're touching it through the digital interface, which is quite standardized. And they're touching it through contact centers where they're actually having a human interaction. So ironically, that human interaction may become more important, but it will be enabled by some of those AI telling the agent, these are the kind of things, this is Jon Lightman, and this is what we should be talking to him about, because we've run all that stuff. So I think some of those things will get mature, or are already fairly mature, quite quickly.
Yeah, it seems to me that just kind of comes back to the same thing. If the contact center is now a profit center, or at least an opportunity to have a more sophisticated customer relationship, both because you get more information through the tech and because you can give more fine-tuned opportunities to the customer, doesn't that really raise the question of how much of that should be shared?
Absolutely. So we've come full circle to that initial discussion about where does the value, and I think a lot of this is going to be tracking value. One thing we haven't talked about is business cases. If you think about outsourcing, there was always a lot of effort put in to say, what's my cost of doing it today? What's going to be my cost of doing it tomorrow? What's the transformation cost of getting from the today model to the tomorrow model? And then what's my reduced run rate going to be? Those models, as we talked about, are very much kind of back office focus on, it's a zero sum game. Let's just reduce the cost of doing this. When we have upside that we can add into this, then we can think about where incremental investments are actually going to have a strong ROI. And business case tracking, which has always been an area, I would say it's part of governance. Back to the G word. Tracking what value, and until I know what value has been derived by what. I can't have an adult discussion with you about how we should share the benefits of that and how you should share it across your other customers. So I think business case tracking and understanding the value and tracking those metrics, becomes more and more important, because, if the AI is suggesting a bunch of stuff that, the call center agent is throwing at the customers, and all it's doing is irritating them because it's not relevant, then we need to know that. So, yeah.
Yeah, so it seems to me one of the interesting things is just the velocity of use cases. And that puts a kind of a strain on planning what you're not doing because you don't know what you're going to plan for until you've had some successes.
There
see what other people
I
are
don't know
doing.
if I would call this, I guess it is governance, but, we've had this idea of the center of excellence model for a long time. It was deployed quite effectively when robotic process automation came out, which was there are a million use cases, but we don't know which ones to do first, and we don't know which are going to be the easiest to unlock.
Just spend a minute to unpack RPA and kind of explain.
Certainly. So RPA was sort of before generative AI. RPA was the kind of just the idea that I could model pretty much what you did on your computer, on your PC, and just have an agent, an automated agent, do pretty much the same thing. So if you have to run a report every day that involves pulling something from one, people used to talk about the swivel chair activities, pulling things from one system into Excel, then figuring out what the exchange rate between two currencies was today, and then putting that in, and then running a pivot table, and then inputting that into another system to then have BI or business intelligence be able to create a report for management. Those kind of tasks are really are ones that can be automated, and there's a lot of good tools out there. There's Automation Anywhere, UiPath, Blue Prism. There's others, and those are RPA agents, and essentially they just replicate what humans do in the same way. So it's almost like they're clicking on the buttons in the application. They're doing the pull down menu. They're running the Excel and whatever. They just do it faster and more effectively. The challenge is when they need fairly standardized processes to be able to do that.
All right, so that's a situation where you would basically replace some of the swivel chair level with better software.
Right? But there were there are limitations for what RPA can do. But the reason I mention RPA is not. I mean, it's still there, and I think one of my other things that I talk about whenever anyone wants is prepared to listen is that nothing ever goes away in business and technology. Every technology that's kind of ever existed almost, from the green screen in the basement and the big mainframe, it's still there somewhere. Every technology that's come along since it has found its place and found its level, but now we're just managing a much broader stack. But the same goes for business processes. We're still doing, we still have staff in most enterprises. We still have staff org where we're just, buying bodies to do stuff. We have managed services. We have as a service. We have platforms. And we have agile pods doing things, and we have all these things now coexisting. And the same is true for technologies like RPA and AI. They all layer on top of one another. And so the challenge of making them all work effectively, just gets more and more of a challenge. So, but the reason that I mentioned RPA is that one of the ways that people tried to deploy it, because it wasn't it's a technology tool, but it supports the business, is they created these centers of excellence that said, hey guys, we exist, we can do all these cool things. They went out, they trained the business and said, okay, bring us your use cases, like bring out your dead, sorry to Monty Python, but bring us your use cases and we'll help you figure out, are they good use cases? How should we prioritize? How should we triage the ones that, are not really fit for RPA? And I think that AI will need a similar kind of, screen in front of it that says, let's as an enterprise figure out where are our use cases, where do we not want to deploy AI because we think it's too big of a regulatory risk or too big of a risk that if it goes wrong, our customers will get held up in the media as pariahs. Where do we not want to use it? Where do we think it's safe to use it? And we'll start to prioritize. Also, let's standardize potentially on a tool set. How are we going to, what technologies are we going to use? What are we going to license? What are we going to deploy? What are we going to train people on? So I think AI as a business tool will need to be owned by IT in the same way that, you have an HR organization in your firm in Moses Singer, and they look after you as an individual employee, but you don't report to HR. HR is an enabling function. And I think for RPA, for AI, the technology group will be the HR for those capabilities. They'll be the care and feeding, they'll be the licensing, they'll be the making sure that they are there. But the value, the deployment will come from them being used by the business.
Yeah, I think the interesting things that I've heard in our discussion are kind of the dynamic quality coupled with the fact that the technology is really, in my mind, it's like archaeology, right? It just builds up over time. And then as you're adding something new, you've got to figure out if you want to break something or not break it. It's in the bottom of the stack.
Or do you just want to wrap something on top of it to kind of mask it? I like the idea of technology archaeologists. It really adds to the, the idea of technology, tech debt that people are talking about. If I'm trying to get rid of your tech debt, am I your technology archaeologist where I'm sweeping away little layers to see what's buried beneath? And I think we've hit on something new here.
Yeah, we're going to trademark land here in a hurry for that. I'm going to ambush you a little bit. So, I'm looking at the Biden executive order on AI, and we know it's limited to federal agencies because that's kind of a scope jurisdictional thing as to what it can do. We know that it was a direction to the patent office and the copyright office to figure out the level of human invention that goes into AI and when it's sufficient to have a human inventor or a human author. But I think a more interesting thing, and I'm kind of interested in your view on this, is in a way it's going to develop both best practices and a safe harbor, right? So if at the end of all the task force and study work that's done by these agencies, and by definition done in different industry sectors because the agencies do regulate different sectors, all right, so we're going to come out with a set of practices, right? So if I were a company, I would go, okay, this looks like a pretty good model for me, And so a couple of things occur to me, and then, you can stop me and bring me back to earth on this, but all right, so we've got these standards that are very helpful as a model that the government is going to essentially say, this is what we're doing, and private sector companies are going to go, I'm not sure what to do, but I'll follow that model. The other side of that is if I follow that model, it's kind of a safe harbor, right? Because
I'm likely to be complying with the legislation that's going to be coming down the pipe. I'm kind of future-proofing my organization a little bit. Yeah, I mean, look. Yeah. First of all, I always think it's funny when the public sector leads the private sector in some of these areas. But I think it is important that we say that technology always comes first, and then the law and regulations, and that they have to catch up with it. I mean, I started my career as a lawyer back in the 90s when biotechnology patenting was fresh. And people were saying, well, I just developed this onco mouse that develops cancer, and I'm going to go get a patent for genetically modified organism. And the patent office had no idea what had hit them. And they were, okay, here's a patent for all genetically modified organisms. And then people sued them and said that's too broad. And so I think we are always in a pendulum swing where, it's hard to get to the right place right off the bat. But it is helpful to have guidelines. The challenge, of course, with law and regulation and all of these things is that they are territorial, whereas at the end of the day, technology and most companies are global. We've seen this with GDPR and others. It's, you kind of have to go to the highest standard if you're going to operate globally. So I wouldn't just limit myself to, what is the US saying? And I think a lot of it is very sensible. But I would say, what are other countries doing? What are other legislations doing? What is China doing? Which is a little scary, but for a topic for another podcast.
Yes, it is.
But how do we want to operate globally? Assuming I'm not just a US-based organization, but even if we have US-based clients who suddenly found that because they're providing services to organizations that are that operate outside of the US, that they are suddenly subject to GDPR in a way that they never expected they would be. So I think sometimes these things creep in. So I think. Look, I think smart companies will be turning to smart advisors, law firms, folks like ISG to say, what should we be deploying in the absence of clear guidance? And clearly when countries like the US are saying, here's a set of guidelines, we need to look at them. But we're also going to get state legislation that's going to, decide on certain things. I believe, and I'm not an expert in the legislation in this area, but I believe there are already states that are looking into, legislating the use of AI and giving people the opt-out rights. Well, if I can opt out of something, does that mean as a company, if I'm getting your car insurance, I need to be able to route Jon's request to a group of, folks going like this? Or do I just say, I don't want your business if you're going to opt out?
I've often wondered about that. Most of the opt-out is to kind of prevent discriminatory behavior. All right, so you're getting a human being with kind of bias. So What have you stepped into?
But also it's a dying industry,
You know?
so I'm rooting it to the group of people who are kind of the last in the world who do that. So I'm not sure that I would trust them more than now. That comes back to the other side of AI, which is how transparent and auditable is it? Yeah. So I think that's another element to this.
So I want to share. I want to share a thought with you going back to the executive order. So it seems to me there's all these directions to all these agencies to think really hard and figure out how to accomplish certain safeguards and proper use of AI. So to me, that creates two things. It creates a great opportunity for vendors because the government's not going to do this without vendors, right? So now there's a whole new set of customers at a higher level. So the vendors have that. And I'll let you comment on that in a minute, but just to finish my thought. So now we're going back to data sharing, right? Which is vendors are learning all kinds of stuff from what NASA's doing or from what the Department of Energy is doing. I presume that'll probably be a little easier to share with private sector clients just because the government is not in the business of hoarding best practices. But I think that changes, to use your word, the ecosystem now, and maybe made the ecosystem better.
You're right. It's not a competitive situation because NASA isn't competitive with Ford, as far as I know. But the reality is that then it injects a whole new, I think, a new level of risk, which is, if I'm using data to train my model, to what extent is data really anonymized? And to what extent can I then use AI to peel back the onion and say, what were the individual data elements that went into training this? So, I was saying 10 years ago that privacy is dead, because if you sorry to get tangent off on privacy, but privacy is dead because, if you look at what's publicly available, your face, your the audio of your voice, etc., what you've posted on social media, what your firm has posted, and then you look at the capability of AI, can you really anonymize anything anymore? Because almost anything can be reverse engineered. So I think if I was a government agency and I was using my data to train AI, my concern would not be that the private sector would use it for their gain, which is obviously, good, generally. My question would be, can nuclear secrets be reverse engineered? This can, et cetera, or can systems be hacked into, or passwords or whatever? So, I'm not an expert in that area, but my worry would be that, that we don't know what AI is capable of. And by sharing your data with a third party that is then going to use it to train a model, might we get to a point where saying, oh, it was fine, it was all anonymized, is not really the answer.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to de-identify or de-anonymize things because the AI is looking at, the entire internet, and it's going to go to social media, or it's going to go to in the private sector, it's going to go to white papers, it's going to go to conference presentations, and it's going to find out that your secret business model it can be reverse engineered, shall we say, by just all the information that it can ingest. And
not to get into the quantum apocalypse, but if you really want to, spread your fear, uncertainty, and doubt, then you have to ask about, if quantum computing is really going to happen. Well, imagine the combination of quantum computing and AI. Once you start to tie these technologies together, then it's quite scary, because if quantum computing can easily crack the kind of encryption models that we have today that rely on sums of prime numbers that are hard to back out of, but relatively easy for quantum computing to do, where they start from the sum of everything and then they kind of peel it back. What if you then start to combine these and say, well, what does an AI with a quantum computer do? So I know that's getting into sci-fi territory, but the reality is that these technology advancements, they're cumulative. They're not happening in series. They're happening together.
All right. So we'll save that for another day, as to what does privacy mean when it's not private. So I guess it's going to boil down to access, right? It's not private, but can you control the access to it?
Well, look, what we're back to, governance. So, data governance, data hygiene, understanding who has what data has been used to train what, how it's like saying, here's a cake, can I have my eggs back? You can't say certain things can't be unbaked. So I think as you give your data to these models, there has to be some recognition that certain things are a one-way street, and you won't be able to, it's not like I roll out version 2.2 and I can always roll back to version 2.1. Some of this stuff is a Pandora's box where once the, not to mix my metaphors, but once the genie's out of the bottle, it's out of the bottle. So I think part of the governance will have to be, what is the risk that once this is done, it can't be dialed back.
Right. And then how do you benefit from that since it's inevitable? Let's focus a second on combining data and AI, because you can't do AI without data. And it's probably pretty hard to make data useful in today's age without running it through a model. So I'm not sure what my question is. I guess my question is, what's the state of industry?
I think that what AI does is it gets around one of the big problems with data analytics, which is that you need to have fresh, clean data, well organized. You need to, it's very hard to do proper analytics when the underlying data is crappy, the garbage in, garbage out. I actually think that AI will be a tool that will be used to not only analyze and create the insights, but also to help to ingest the right data, decide what data will be useful for the model. So I think it'll kind of be at both ends. It'll be basically helping to create some data hygiene or say that actually data hygiene is irrelevant. It doesn't matter. We've been talking about process harmonization for a long time. Well, if AI can, get your purchase order without having to have a standardized process, who cares? Like if it's got an input and it's got an output and it's, 99.999% accurate, do I really care whether it's doing the same thing in a repeat? Does repeatability even matter anymore? So I do think that we start to focus more on an outcome-output kind of world, which is what I guess we've been driving towards for a long time, which is I don't really care how much effort goes into it. I care about the value of what comes out of it. So I think that, to return to your question, AI will help analytics models to understand, do I even need good data hygiene? Will I be able to use AI to kind of, to say, well, I can get insights despite the fact that my data is horrible?
Yeah, and most data it's a tough problem for the guys who do data integrity and data management and data security. So it's an interesting thought that you've given about how AI it has a lot of unknowns in certain areas, but the known unknown here is that you can just do more with less quality or without improving the data quality because the AI will impose it just by its operation.
I think fundamentally when if we return to this as, you started the conversation with, how does outsourcing benefit or, how a company's going to engage with third parties and benefit. I think, we're back to the very first value of outsourcing, back to the, the IBM in the 80s, which is, not everyone can become an expert in this, and it doesn't make sense for every company to become an expert. So it actually becomes back to the first tenet of outsourcing, which is we don't need everyone to be an expert. Let's just leave it to the people who are really going to make the investments in R&D, really going to make the investments in developing these things that are useful. So it's back to economies of scale and not doing what's not your core competence, which is sort of, again, another full circle thing. And then to what extent can I hold my provider accountable if these things do cause me harm, and to what extent can I hold my provider to account if they get fringe benefits from what I've given them? Can I take some of those to the bank? So I think it will change the way we do deals. I don't think in and of itself it's the single most important aspect. I do think the more the idea of the death of the steady state might change the way we do deals a little bit differently, but it is a contributing factor and another complexity that needs to be managed. And many of the tropes of the way that we've always done it, back to the QWERTY keyboard, I think just bringing out your template outsourcing agreement doesn't address any of these challenges. They all need to be thought through afresh. So, companies that say, well, we've been doing this for decades, we have a standard template for how we outsource. Unfortunately, it won't address any of these with any nuance, and it may address them in a way that is actually disadvantageous to your company.
Well, this has been great. We'll save for another day discussing about, visualization and how it has to be dynamic when you're measuring all kinds of things that are moving, and everybody seems to love a dashboard. So how do you keep your dashboards realistic? But I want to thank you, Jon. This has just been terrific. A lot of great insights. And, I'm going to outsource some of my thinking to you. I think I've been very impressed by this.
I'll do some of your thinking if you'll do some of my day job for me. How's that, Bill?
I'll share my learning, but only up to a point, Jon. And then that's where we're going to go. So thanks very much. And I think that it's impossible to take out outsourcing from the economy. So when you change I always thought, just to interrupt myself, talking about e-commerce was kind of a little crazy, right? Because e-commerce is just commerce, And I think AI is going to pervade business. So, you're not going to really have AI lawyers in 5 years. You're just going to have business lawyers in 5 years. But anyhow, let's end it there just for the sake of convenience. And again, be fun to continue, as we will. Thanks.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to AI and Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast represent those of the host and individuals being interviewed, and not necessarily those of PLI. For more AI-related content from the Practicing Law Institute, visit pli.edu/AIPod.